Well, we have a dynamic program for you all this morning, and so we are going to jump right in. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Juhanna Rogers. I'm the Vice President for Racial Equity and Social Impact here at CenterState CEO. I would like to welcome you all this morning to our first conversation around race at the intersections of business and the community. Today's panel is sponsored by Berkshire Bank, and the session today is recorded. So I just wanted to let all attendees know for our internal purposes. But without further ado, I'm going to allow our sponsor just to welcome everybody this morning, and then we'll come back right after Chris from Berkshire Bank.
Okay. Thank you, Juhanna. Good morning to everyone and welcome to our distinguished panelists that are joining us. I want to start by congratulating Dr. Rogers and her team for the hard work in making this critically important community initiative a reality today, despite all the challenges of COVID that we're all facing. On behalf of Berkshire Bank and my Central New York colleagues, we are sincerely honored to be a longtime supporter of CenterState CEO and sponsor today's event and the new racial equity online toolkit that you'll hear about later. At Berkshire, we are committed to diversity, inclusion, and racial equity through what is part of our core values. We had approached Rob and Dr. J several months ago to help support their efforts in addressing equity in our workplaces. The resources that have been developed today by CenterState have turned out to be a really perfect fit for Berkshire. I very much look forward to working with CenterState and Dr. Rogers over the next 3 years and helping build a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace throughout our Central New York community. So with that, Dr. J, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, we're not going to belabor too much because we have a dynamic line of individuals to speak with you this morning. And it's rare that I get the opportunity to just sit back and sort of kind of engage, but with these 4 individuals, I'll definitely have the opportunity to do that this morning. But let me just talk to you and frame the conversation. Thanks to Berkshire Bank, as we've said, the work around the CenterState Equity Toolkit was able to come to fruition over the late fall and holiday season. And so that was released on February 1st. It is our first attempt, and there will be more added to it, to get the business community involved in equity work and talking about some of the social responsibilities that organizations, corporate entities may have to address racial inequities as well as other social justice issues. And so if you have not been onto the site, I'll share the link a little bit later. But what we wanted to do today is create some opportunities to come in and have strategic conversations with some national experts on matters of race and equity. And we have aligned Dr. Lomax Campbell, Dr. Darnisa Amante-Jackson, Dr. Nadrea Njoku, and our colleague Sadie Fisher to come together to talk about the ways that their work is driving equity, how you could utilize some of the knowledge or practices that they have launched in their communities to help you all think about the work that you were doing, charged to do, aspire to do, and take it back hopefully into your communities or into your companies and start some conversations. The format for today, I'm going to open it up to each panelist. They're going to have 6 to 8 minutes to provide some remarks and thoughts. At the conclusion of the last panelist, we're going to open it up for questions. And so if you haven't attended one of the sessions that I've hosted before, then you will know I'm an advocate for cutting your cameras on. Let's see your faces, especially in conversations like this. It's great to see who's listening, build community around these conversations and break down barriers. So don't be shy. If there's comments, agreements, questions, please use the chat, and we will open up for question and answer once the panelists have concluded their remarks. So this is me, Dr. Juhanna Rogers. Many of you may already be familiar with a lot of my work, but I was trained at Indiana University in higher education, but specifically looking at critical race theories and the intersections of the Black experience in communities. And so a lot of that work has taken me across the country and different parts of the world, exploring the ways that race and racial identities have shaped specific experiences for diverse populations. The Dominican Republic, the Latino community, as well as the African American community have been the focus of a lot of my research when it comes to this topic. So that is some about me. And now we're going to move on and introduce our first panelist, Dr. Lomax Campbell. Lomax has 18 years of experience in the small business, entrepreneurship, higher education, and government administration. His expertise encompasses management, organizational culture change, ethnic psychology, urban entrepreneurship, and inclusive workforce and economic development practices. He currently is a director of the Mayor's Office of Community Wealth Building in Rochester. And in that role, he's tasked with serving diverse residential businesses, small business clientele to foster an equitable economic growth opportunities for folks who are in that area in the city of Rochester. I've heard Lomax speak and been a fan of his work for a long time, so I'm honored to have him on the panel with us today. So without further ado, Dr. Lomax Campbell.
All right, first and foremost, Hotepu, which means joy, everybody. Happy to be in the Zoom room with you. You saw the picture with the shirt and tie on, so today you get me in my cultural attire. I do have a few slides to guide our conversation, and thank you, Dr. Rogers, for inviting me to be a part of this illustrious panel. I can't wait to hear what my colleagues are going to be sharing from their stories. And so I'm going to get in a little bit of mine over here in Rochester, New York. Just a thumbs up. Can you see the slides okay? See the screen okay? Excellent, excellent. I wanted to clarify, I'm in the city of Rochester, New York, not Minnesota, just in case anybody was wondering. So a couple slides. First, I'll briefly touch my bio slide just to lift a little bit of my training from there, but then I'll give you a brief office overview to set the context and then get into the high-level economic development strategy I've been running with my team and regional collaborators over the last 2.5 years under Mayor Lovely Ann Warren here in the city of Rochester. And then I'll wrap up with what I perceive to be our keys to success for the benefit of those of you who are exploring ways to do similar types of things within your respective organizations and places. So as mentioned, I have a broad management and cultural community development organizing background. I've been kind of trained some of everywhere, most recently a certificate of completion from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, focused on leading economic growth in the summer of last year. But I'm probably most proud of some of the work I've done around really understanding the intersection between organizational culture, niche or market segments, and this idea of ethnic psychology to bring this kind of lens into the field of management through my doctoral work. And so you'll hear a little bit about how my office was an experimentation of applying the things that I've studied throughout my academic journey. So the mission of community wealth building, the Office of Community Wealth Building in this context, is really to facilitate broad-based collaboration across sectors or sector partners and across the community to ultimately advance these principles. And if anybody hasn't heard of the principles of community wealth building, essentially what it is bottoms up economic development. So instead of centering exporters and manufacturing, you're centering the actual people from the community, the assets in a regional or local community. So it's hyper local. And you're building the capacity, the talents, the networks, the systems, the structures that really allows those hyperlocal and regional communities to thrive. And so it's an equity agenda by constitution. And so in our office, we focus on both residents and small businesses in what I call a culturally congruent way, but also sustainably. And without going deep into this, my office is broken out into 3 different work groups. And so today I'm speaking from the work that my business development work group has been doing over the last few years around building a comprehensive economic development strategy. But you can see we do community development and financial empowerment work as well. And I should note that we're the 2nd office of community wealth building in the country after Richmond, Virginia. Just want to lift that up. So here's the high level action plan that we've been kind of working from our sheet of music, where when I was first hired, the mayor said, I want you to help build or spearhead the development of Rochester's entrepreneurial ecosystem, which I found out later through the work of Kauffman Foundation with their eShip Summit, which was really geared around the interconnections and relationships across the various supports that ensure small businesses and entrepreneurs have fertile grounds to establish, sustain, expand, and thrive within a community. We also talked about the establishment of regional scorecards and evaluations to standardize whether or not someone's coming out of anybody's programs or obtaining resources, and that they're concept ready, launch ready, capital ready, procurement ready, expansion ready. You understand what I'm saying? The different markers of the business development lifecycle to indicate that a business is ready for that next step. And because we know all services and organizational supports for small businesses are not created equal, we wanted to look at ecosystemic enhancements after building that ecosystem. And where we saw gaps, D was really around establishing new business development programs to close those gaps. And so we took a phased implementation approach to doing that, and we're going to talk about 2 of them. I will say, from my background and experience, everything I do is evidence-based. And so just to show you the conceptual model without getting too academic, decisions are made at the center of different types of evidence. Oftentimes we talk about data, we only care about numbers in organizational life, but the actual qualitative experiences of people that we serve and the context or the backdrop within which these things happen matter. Practitioners' experiences, as you're going to hear in this panel, matter. And so trying to balance those things is what kind of guided us. And I'll say that over the last 2.5 years, we've raised nearly $2 million to support the work that we're doing. So just to show you that our evidence-based approach has been effective within our context of upstate New York or Western New York. All right. So the first effort, we received support from Living Cities to participate in their cohort 5 of their City Accelerator initiative. And this was before we were ready to roll out this program, this effort, this ecosystemic effort. It was really catalytic support to really understand what the needs of our underserved business community really was. And so we were able to use their resources to host 4 focus groups, particularly targeting Black, Latino, women-owned businesses, and businesses that generated over $100,000 in revenue or had done business with the city in some capacity, whether they got zoning done, whether they received a loan or grant, whether they participated in city procurement, any interaction with the city. And we wanted to understand also from surveying, so qualitative and quantitatively, so mixed methods, you know, what were the gaps? What are the aspirations? What are the challenges? What are the interests? Also, too, the project team, by virtue of the relationship with Living Cities, was required to attend an Undoing Racism training down in Austin, Texas. And actually that particular training had 45 people in it. But you'll see later, we hosted 3 additional workshops in Rochester, and we're able to get 85 people to attend those trainings from our ecosystem. And so here are the founding partners of our ecosystemic efforts here in Rochester. You know, we learned that broad-based collaboration matters. It helps convince funders that the community is serious, but it also helps with integration across silos and policy change. We've regionally branded our ecosystem solutions Nexus I-90 because Rochester is the nexus along I-90 corridor between Buffalo and Syracuse, New York. That was the logic there. And we appreciate our collaborators for choosing to do so. So the first system, Nexus I-90, is all of the things you see on the screen here. It's a resources navigator, currently with about 42 different business support organizations in there. It's a hotline where individuals can call and say, hey, who do I talk to about X, Y, and Z? It's a comprehensive business workshop calendar. And there's a blog, still working that out. And there's a backend CRM system, a client relationship management system, allowing currently 10 license holders across 6 organizations to collaborate and share client data and things of that nature, so that we can be more effective and not have small businesses have to answer the same questions over and over again, like what's your name, why did you start a business, what's the name of your business, and things of that nature. What are your goals? They're tracked in the system. And so we built this system. We've identified about 150 entrepreneur support organizations. And so we're about a third of the way having them listed. I mentioned that several of them have attended additional undoing racism trainings, and that was to give a systemic and structural analysis of how racism plays out. So it's not just I hate you because you're Black, but literally, the insidious and more subtle ways that it manifests across systems. And we're embarking on additional work around broadening the access to that shared CRM system so that all 150 regionally identified ESOs, entrepreneur support organizations, can have access to deeper levels of collaboration. Hopefully I'm not going too fast, but I was told I had 6 to 8 minutes. The other program I'll kind of touch on briefly is the ecosystemic enhancement. I realize again that all supports aren't created equal, and coming up as a serial entrepreneur since 2003 myself, I had either taught in a lot of the programs or was a participant in a lot of the programs. And so my thinking was, just like funders pull different cities into cohort-based learning programs to transform their communities, what if we did that within our community and had 5 to 6 entrepreneur support organizations receive funding, something that often is not geared towards systemic and structural change, have the opportunity to receive coaching and supports in a cohort fashion to improve structurally and systemically, and had them go through undoing racism training. And so this is where a lot of the other projects in our master plan are kind of being couched. And this is cohort 1. And these are predominantly organizations that serve the community that reflects Rochester. So in short, Walker's Legacy predominantly works with Black and brown women in the spirit of Madam C.J. Walker. Urban League predominantly works with Black small businesses and community residents, even though they serve everybody. Ibero predominantly works with the Latino community. BLSP works with low to moderate income families and businesses, trying to help them get formed without having to pay a cost if they qualify. Greater Works Collaborative works with previously incarcerated individuals, helping them gain digital literacy and credentials to either go into the workforce or start a business. And the commissary helps formalize food-based businesses who have been operating illegitimately in the informal economy. And so I think our keys to success is that we've taken a holistic approach that was culturally responsive and asset-based to serving Black and brown entrepreneurs. This is kind of like a quick graphic from my chapter 5 of my dissertation, my model for how do you not be linear, but holistic in how you support whatever it is that your organization is missioned to do. And so you can see it's top down, bottom up, inside out, outside in, at all levels of organizations and across organizational life. So I'll leave that there for the Q&A session, and happy to entertain questions after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lomax. The presentation was really great. To help those that are listening into the sessions, I'll come back and offer just some thoughts for you to think about. Lomax presented what he's leading, the work the city of Rochester is doing to think about entrepreneurs, diverse entrepreneurs, if you will, and their engagement and connection to revenue generating opportunities, right? And so while we have some entrepreneurs I know here on the phone or on the Zoom room here, the model that he talked about for those outside of the entrepreneurship realm, I want you to think about how is it that you are maybe thinking about connecting or partnering with more diverse entrepreneurs? What do your organization's requirements around vendors partnerships look like in order to help create revenue generating opportunities for small or diverse entrepreneurs. But more importantly, I think his points about the top down, inside out North Star model is, if you're thinking about initiatives or strategy or work around equity within your organization, how are you thinking about doing that from a really culturally affirming lens, right? And how are you thinking about it more radically maybe than we have before, and that we really need to think about what systems can we disrupt. With that point, I'm going to move on to our next panelist, but I want you to think about some of those questions as she shares with us some of her thoughts, some of her work, and some of her recommendations on doing race and equity work in the workplace. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Darnisa Amante-Jackson. She is an educational and racial equity strategist that is deeply committed to the studies of culture, innovation, equity, and adult development. Since earning her master's in social cultural anthropology from Brandeis and her doctorate from the Harvard's Educational Leadership Doctoral Program, Dr. Amante-Jackson has honed her knowledge to transform organizations, nonprofits, and schools on issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Dr. Amante-Jackson to share remarks with you this morning.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, and really looking forward to showing you 2 slides today. And thank you to Dr. Campbell for just getting us started and going. Really appreciated your segment. So I know that was a really mouthy bio, so let me tell you a little bit more about what I do. Folks like to call me the racial equity Ghostbuster. So really, I am the jackass of all trades equity, sort of a racial interventionist, Indiana Jones type. So I'm an anthropologist by trade, and then became an educator and used those skills to continue to transform culture, both in education, with nonprofits, with boards, in communities, and with corporations. So the presentation that I'm going to offer today is sort of it can work in all of those places, but most specifically, it works for life, right? I think DEI often gets a bad rap. And a lot of times people think it's not work that brings us together. But what I feel like is it really is a return to humanism. I think along the way, we've forgotten how to be in difficult conversation with each other. And I think that difficult conversations are a wonderful thing when they're facilitated well. So I'll start my section by saying this. I love urgency. And the last thing you want are urgent people who have no skills to be urgent. Urgent people with no skills do harm in our best intentions. So this is sort of what exactly is the work, and then how do we approach it in a systemic way? So I'll start here by telling you first that I am both the president and founder of the D-Suite. So I own 3 organizations that partner with education, executive leadership coaching, and corporations, nonprofit, and community to really sort of approach this systemic change. And one of the biggest things that I often hear is that DEI is the same thing. So I created a roadmap to sort of talk about it. So that's where we'll start. So this is the DBIE spectrum. Some of you might have seen belonging in my bio and might not have been exactly sure what that was, but this is a great slide. So for those of you who love laminating, if you have a Cricut machine at home, there's always somebody on a call with a Cricut. If you don't know what a Cricut is, that's okay. The people with Cricuts know what it is, right? This is a good laminatable slide that you write on and then wipe it off. So this is actually the roadmap, and I'll start by telling you how long it takes. DEI often takes in an organization less than 100 people 8 to 15 years to manifest. I know, 8 to 15 years. So if you think about it, each of these buckets is 2 to 3 years. So I'll explain the slide and I'll tell us a little bit more about it. For those of you who like analogies, at the bottom, you have an analogy to a party. So this arrow at the top, this one up here, is super important because it contains a concept that many of us don't think about in business or when partnering with community, which is that people do not fear change, they fear loss. And you see, equity triggers loss for people. It feels zero sum. It feels like this backdoor Robin Hood, right? Where we're taking, or this is what we think, we're taking from people who've worked hard and we're giving it to people who have not worked as hard. And that is not what equity is. I'll tell us what it is when we get there. But because of that, the reason that people don't change, businesses don't transform, community doesn't feel a different sense of belonging is because most of us as leaders have not considered that people are experiencing loss. And you see, the further along you go in the spectrum, the harder the work gets. Do you know why everybody loves diversity so much? You don't have to give anything up. On this spectrum, diversity is equality. That's why everyone loves it. And the further along you go, the more you ask people to lose. Now, loss is not money. Loss could be a sense of certainty. You know, yesterday you knew how to do your job, and today we learned about systemic oppression, and tomorrow you feel like a beginner again. So some people feel a loss of expertise. This work also tells us that you can't look out of windows to do it. So looking out of a window is when you look out and you say, why are they not doing this? Why is this community not doing that? Equity and this journey calls us into stepping away from windows and looking into mirrors. We have to implicate ourselves as a part of the problem to implicate ourselves as a part of the solution. And do you know what happens when you implicate yourself? People look in the mirror and they no longer feel like they see the same person. To be biased is to be human, folks. We are perfectly imperfect people doing perfectly imperfect work forever. But most of us have been taught to only see your good side when you look in the mirror. And when you learn your bias, for some of us, we feel guilt. We feel remorse. We feel like, how could I not have known? So that's the kind of loss I'm talking about, right? It's not a loss of money. It's usually competency, certainty, expertise, a sense of knowing who you are in the world. And why is this arrow important? When leaders do not communicate to loss that people feel, their anxiety gets so high. And this is not to belittle the mental condition of anxiety, right? I don't want to belittle that. But I'm talking about that sense of, I don't know what to do. This is too much. The overwhelm gets so high that people opt out of the work. Let's be thoughtful here. We're talking about equity. So normally the folks who are white or white presenting often opt out because you have the privilege to. Privilege is not money. Privilege is something you don't have to worry about, right? So we're not blaming or shaming today. We're on the way to humanity, right? I'm just naming that it often leaves people of color or BIPOC community behind to do the work when we are actually experiencing the trauma in the middle of doing the work. We often can't opt out. So that's why it's important to know loss is happening so you can speak to it. Now, here's the spectrum. These arrows, right? You would think this journey is linear. It is not. You know why? Because people in your organization and your community are on a spectrum. At the same time, you've had people who've never talked about culture before in this way, is the same time you have people who came out of the womb ready to fight for social justice, right? So if you just tailor your strategy to one place, it's overwhelming for some and underwhelming for others. And you know what we often do? We always go back to the beginning. And we say, well, we're constantly onboarding new staff and, well, we're constantly learning. And if you keep going back to the beginning, it never allows your employees who are more skilled to take your organization further. You want to be tailoring multiple prongs of this strategy at the same time. Okay, so think about it like this. You want a little bit of sprinkling of diversity, a little bit of belonging, a little bit of inclusion, and together they make us an equity cake, right? Equity is the combination of the first three things on this spectrum. And now let's just talk about the skills. So diversity is the beginning of the work. It's not the end goal. Diversity is not a balanced scorecard. It's deeper than demographic data. Diversity says, have you created a culture of curiosity in your workplace? So what that means is, if you never give people time to talk about themselves outside of work, they never talk about themselves outside of work. right? So diversity, you know you're doing it well because you start with demographic data, but you're doing that to authenticate your employees and communities' experiences, right? That's the only reason why we're capturing data. We often think diversity is an increased representation racially. It's no, how many different ethnicities, perspectives, conversations about lived experiences are you creating in your work environment? You know you're doing diversity well because you would know what people need to be seen outside of their work function. For example, you can look at me and tell that I'm Black, but the most important thing that I always want you to know is that I'm from Brooklyn. But nobody ever asked that, right? Because I got stories. I just always have to talk about the fact that I'm Black as you can see it. But the fact that I'm from Brooklyn and I am very Brooklyn and I celebrate a lot of Brooklyn things is the thing that makes me feel belonged. And that's what I want my employer to talk about. Also, there's always somebody on this call from Brooklyn. Okay, shout outs to 11207. If anybody knows where that is, hello, that's East New York. For those of you who are like, what? East New York, Brooklyn, right? Belonging is this concept that we often skip. We go diversity to inclusion. Let me tell you why that's dangerous. This is like leaping the Grand Canyon without a running start. Inclusion is all about voice. Inclusion says if you keep having the same perspectives, planning your party, you are recreating oppression in a new name. It's the same thing because the same perspectives are informing our planning. And you know what we often do? We diversify our workplace, right? So we get the number, and then we immediately invite people who've never been to leadership tables, and then we get upset when they say nothing. You know, if you don't create belonging, and you invite marginalized voices to leadership tables, they feel tokenized. People don't know if you actually want them there for the sake of their voice or the sake of their look. Oh, sorry, Sharon. I don't have the ability to mute you, but I hope that's a good call. Sharon, Abert, excuse me. Okay. Belonging starts with name pronunciation. So this is the sweet spot. For those of you who are wondering, how do I impact community? How do I really drive the change? Most of the change happens in belonging. Belonging is all about making people feel welcome. So think about it like this. Diversity is everybody bring a dish to the potluck. Belonging is tell me why this dish matters to you, and then tell me how you've been treated with this dish. Non-belonging or people feeling invisible, as I start to wrap, is all about the absence of something. You know, the absence of something can still be a something. This one says, if you don't actually know what people need to be seen, you will invisibilize them. They will not feel welcome in your environment and they don't stay. For those of you who are like recruitment, yes. Do you know what you're recruiting for? You're recruiting for belonging. BIPOC communities are looking at your culture and your advancement plans and how you will make people feel authentically seen. And this is the segment that we never talk about, but this is the thing that drives cultural change. It drives community change because when people feel seen, they feel championed for. And when people feel championed for, they show up differently. They show up in your culture differently, and they manifest change differently because you've invested in what they need. Belonging, I'm getting on my equity soapbox because I love belonging, right? So belonging is all about affinity groups, employee resource groups, having difficult conversations. Remember, we said productive discourse can be a great thing when it's facilitated well. And then lastly, because I'm gonna give y'all all this to percolate for the Q&A, we have equity. Equity is not Robin Hood. Equity is about removing predictability. Equity says you shouldn't know which community members are more likely to be impacted. You shouldn't know which people are more likely to be hired. You shouldn't know which network you're most likely to be able to recruit from. And the reason for that is because inequity is a design. It's baked into policies and practices. And if you don't change them, if you don't look at policies, if you don't look at thoughts and beliefs, you'll never remove the predictability that inequity creates. You know you're doing equity well because we wouldn't know who's most likely to be recruited. We wouldn't know who was most likely to stay. And equity names something really important, and I'll stop sharing my screen, which is equality assumes that if you give everyone the same thing, that they can achieve the same thing. But equity knows something different, which is that there are people, and meritocracy doesn't exist. There are people in this country who can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, because there are some people who don't have boots, who don't have straps, and who don't have feet. And inequity creates ceilings that prevent people, even in their hardest, from achieving. So equity is all about focusing on the policy change, the structural changes that create that predictability that we have, because equity knows that we actually have a belief on what normal is, and we shouldn't.
Thank you. Thank you. I tried to keep up with just some of the nuggets that you just shared, Dr. Jackson. That was wonderful. And I think that's that equity lens, right, is so important. And that's why we've chosen to focus on that lens here at CenterState. And I think that time frame of recognizing that this work is deep work. It's deep work, and it's going to take a collaborative effort. As Dr. Campbell pointed out, it's going to take dedicated time and consistency, as you've pointed out, thinking about belonging in the way in which we're laying out the different components of our journeys as a community, but also as independent entities, and you as individuals within those entities. And so following that, we have a dear friend of mine, but also a brilliant scholar around creating inclusive spaces, specifically for underrepresented students, Black women, but also very uniquely, Dr. Nadrea Njoku also focuses on the power of historically Black colleges and universities. And so I've asked her to join the panel today because, as many of you on the call have talked about, is here, even at CenterState, we're talking about how to attract diverse talent. How do we build cultures of inclusion? How do we get our young people to stay? How do we attract more diverse young people? And so Dr. Nadrea Njoku, many of you may recognize her. She and myself were part of the Great Eight that graduated from Indiana University. Dr. Njoku's PhD's research and foci includes student success and career pathways at historically Black colleges and universities, with a specific focus on the influence of campus environment and student development theory. She positions this work in critical race and feminist frameworks that is devoted to disrupting issues of race and gender within the education context. She's a graduate of Xavier University of Louisiana and Indiana University. Dr. Njoku.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rogers, which I'm so excited to say. And I just want to say that Dr. Amante-Jackson and Dr. Campbell really set the stage for my comments. I have three primary questions that I like to ask when I'm thinking about how we recruit students to career pathway environments, particularly internships and externships. Just to give you a little bit more about me, as Juhanna stated, I'm a senior research associate with the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute. And we are a research institute that is housed inside the United Negro College Fund. I think people are usually familiar with UNCF as a scholarship producer, a fundraising organization. It's famous for, its mass ball dinners and raising millions of dollars for historically Black colleges and universities. However, at FDPRI, we are charged with the research and the task of assisting UNCF, as well as their other offices, which include the Institute for Capacity Building, in evaluation practices and research that informs good practice and helps these institutions to build capacity. I do not have a slide presentation. I'm going to just talk. However, when I am finished, I will share some very helpful links describing and pointing you to avenues in which I point out. So for those of us, I know that we haven't, I don't know where everyone is zooming in from. However, I do know that we're in the Northeast, and New York is a wonderful environment for a multitude of races and perspectives, but however, I do know that New York is not a place where we actually have a historically Black college and university. So I'd like to provide a definition for everyone who's not familiar, and then give some context about some of the great graduates that graduate from historically Black colleges and universities. So HBCUs are any historically Black college or university that was established prior to 1964, whose principal's mission was and is the education of Black Americans, and that is accredited by a nationally recognized accrediting agency or association determined by the Secretary of Education. HBCUs offer all students, regardless of race, an opportunity to develop their skills and talents. These institutions train young people who go on to serve domestically and internationally in the profession as entrepreneurs and public and private sectors. And to, just give you some context, HBCUs graduate some of our most prominent African Americans. If you think about the Civil Rights the Civil Rights Movement, you will immediately think of Martin Luther King, who was a graduate of Morehouse College and HBCU in Atlanta. If we think about today, we think about Miss Stacey Abrams, who is a graduate of Spelman College here in Atlanta. Our new Vice President, Kamala Harris, who is a graduate of Howard University and HBCU in DC. If you want to think about the arts, Amy Sherrill, who is the portrait artist for Michelle Obama's portrait just a few years ago, she's a graduate of Clark Atlanta University. Bisa Butler, who works outside of New Jersey, also is a graduate of Howard University and a craft artist. If you think about literature, Toni Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes are all graduates of HBCUs. If you think about drama, your favorite television shows or movies, Taraji P. Henson is a graduate of Howard, so is Chadwick Boseman, Black Panther. Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee are both graduates of Morehouse College. Alice Walker attended Spelman. Oprah Winfrey went to Tennessee State University. If you've ever shot a Super Soaker, Lonnie Johnson, creator of the Super Soaker, graduated from Tuskegee University. If you've ever gone to the vet and encountered an African-American veterinarian, it's most likely they graduated from Tuskegee University. The institution that graduates the most African-Americans who go to medical schools is Xavier University of Louisiana, where I graduated. There are an enormous amount of teachers that come out of South Carolina that go to Claflin University, and Spelman is widely known for the STEAM graduates that they graduate. And so to move on to our topic, Juhanna asked me to talk about, where and how can we recruit Black students? And I think the stage was set with the commentary from our previous two panelists. The three questions that I like to ask when we're thinking about how we're recruiting, retaining, and making these prospective employees belong in our organizations are: where are we recruiting them from? What resources can we provide them? And what do they say about the time that they spent with us? And so when we're thinking about recruiting students, obviously as an advocate of HBCUs, I advocate and promote HBCUs as spaces and places where there is a wealth of talent, not just talent, but phenomenal innovators who are ready to enter the workforce and work for a variety of employers across the United States and internationally. When you're thinking about the HBCUs that you want to recruit from, you might normally think about Spelman and Morehouse because we often hear about them in the press. They have, as well as Howard and Hampton University, they have some of the biggest endowments, so they get, a lot of attention. However, we should also think about the small and unknown institutions. These institutions might be located in rural environments, but as Dr. Campbell pointed out, that if we pool our resources, we could potentially recruit from these institutions, which might on the face feel like they don't have a lot of talent to provide for our purposes, but by volume, they produce highly qualified candidates. And then what resources can we provide for them? I think I always like to point out to employers who want to recruit interns or prospective candidates from these institutions not just HBCUs, but any student that qualifies for a Pell Grant, is that not every student is available and able to participate in a free internship or a free experience. These students are overwhelmingly under-resourced. And so if they're going to think about a potential opportunity, they have to think about what that potential opportunity may provide, not only for them, but their families that they support at home. So free internships aren't necessarily a draw for these institutions. They have needs that surpass students who are not qualified for Pell. So when you're recruiting them, we need to think about the resources that you can provide. And if that isn't a paid internship, definitely support and travel to that particular opportunity will definitely be a promising opportunity for them rather than something that they have to finance themselves. And if financing these opportunities are not in your wheelhouse, then as Dr. Campbell highlighted, we should think about community organizations that we could partner with so that we can pull resources in order to provide them with opportunities. If I speak about the education field, there is the Southern Education Foundation. They have a set of SELI fellows. It's 25 to 30 students that they recruit every year to participate in summer internships. They set these students up with paid internships at organizations free of cost to the organization. So the organization doesn't have to pay for the internship, but a sponsoring community organization might be able to provide those students with an opportunity to place them in your organization so that they might get an experience that adds to their resume, but you might also find a qualified candidate for the pool of opportunities that you have. And then I think Dr. Amante-Jackson really set out, a brilliant stage for what we need to look at. It's not just about recruiting these students and having them sign up for an opportunity. It's about the experience that they get when they're there. You have to ask the question, do they feel like they belong? Will they return? And if they do not return, what are they saying about your organization after they have left? Word of mouth, word of mouth surpasses any industry standard. Word of mouth can take us so far. So what are our students and our interns saying about the institutions that they interact with? And would they promote your institution for an internship next year? So those are things that we really need to think about. Seminars like Dr. Campbell pointed out, Undoing Racism, or hiring vendors like Dr. Amante-Jackson to come in and have realistic, honest, and hard conversations with your institutions, to do trainings, to prep your employees and your organizations to receive these students are very vital and critical to retaining them after that experience. I don't know if I have time, Juhanna, but for the sake of time, I will conclude my comments and save my own personal gems about guided pathways, workforce development for the Q&A. And I will definitely drop a lot of links as well as notes in the comments for our participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Njoku. I put in the chat, as Dr. Njoku talked about partnerships and examples of programs that exist in her local area. I also wanted to mention Say Yes, the Synergy program through Mercy Works, On Point for College. These are 3 local entities that work with Syracuse City School District graduates or students of color or from underrepresented backgrounds to have paid internship opportunities. And this time of year is when they're looking for organizations to partner with in order to offer those opportunities. And so while Dr. Njoku is talking specifically about historically Black colleges, which I think our region has the opportunity to make more connections there and to support and think about ways to create bridge programs, I also just wanted to highlight there are local programs already set up to get students, underrepresented students that are studying across the country. I had an internship opportunity with a young woman that was attended a HBCU last summer, and she was from Syracuse. And so I want to make sure that we contextualize that to say there are students from Syracuse that attend historically Black colleges, many of them do. And so thinking about ways to get them back into some of the organizations and leadership positions would be great. For our last panelist, but certainly not least, I want to introduce a colleague who is doing some dynamic work here in Central New York, and she has been working with me over the last several months to think about how we can collaborate and continue to push this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion forward. I'd like to bring on Sadie Fisher. She is a dynamic, highly sought after award-winning queer feminist Latina speaker who is known for her energy and passion around social justice issues. She is currently the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Excellus Blue Cross and Blue Shield, where she embeds her 16 years of social justice experience into the corporate world. As Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, she develops, leads, and executes the company's corporate DEI strategy. So for those that have are representing different organizations thinking about how to do a lot of what Dr. Campbell, Dr. Amante-Jackson, or what Dr. Njoku is speaking about, Sadie Fisher is someone that has manifested and is leading a dynamic body of work. So without further ado, Sadie.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and give me one moment. And can you all see the PowerPoint? Let me just move this.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Dr. J, and for all those who have gone before me have really set an incredible stage to really think about the background of why we do this work, why it's important. So really what I want to kind of talk about is just where to start. So many of you are probably feeling really inspired right now and are like, well, where do I start, or what do I do within my own organizations? And I think first of all, just think about, your culture. What is the culture of your organization? Have you defined any of these things? So often our culture, right, we know where it is. It's this poster on the wall. We can point to it. We can see it. But unless those values are actually brought in to the day-to-day interactions of an organization, then they really just are a poster on the wall. Words that people know, can point to, but how do we begin to embed that into an organization? And so when you think about organizational cultures, it's a variety of different things, right? It's our policies and practices, our procedures, the how we get our work done, right? A lot of times people will talk about it's not about what you do, it's about how you do it. Same thing about the workplace, right? How are you implementing these things? How are we evaluating performance? Is it also based on how people show up? Not just did you get the work done, but how did you get it done? Who did you work with? Did you collaborate with others? Did you embody the values within the organization? And then again, those individual and group behaviors. There's a lot out there that says, and plenty of research, that if you don't define the culture, your employees will define it for you. And so how do you work around, there are those spoken, the implicit, right, and explicit cultures that we have. If we're not explicit about what our expectations are as an organization, then implicitly there will be things that get defined for us. And then our leader behaviors, right? What are we also expecting of all of our leaders? So in terms of where to start, right? I think the first spot is the awareness. Like, is your organization ready? What are the problems that you see within your organization, right? What are some of the issues and the barriers? Is it leadership? Is it certain policies? Do you have someone who's designated, right, to be able to do this work? And then I think the other important component is starting to identify the why. And many folks have spoken before, like, why even bother around talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So identifying solutions and setting those expectations. And then, anytime we're defining the why and educating folks on what it is that we're doing and why we're doing this, it's also important then to implement and also have accountability and take action. What happens if people don't engage in this way? What happens if people aren't following, right, the values? Is there action that we're willing to take? And even regardless of who it is, right, if it's in a leadership position, what are the accountability factors? And how are we truly embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion into the fabric of the organization? And then evaluating success. I've heard so much about folks, sharing previously. It really is about sometimes trial and error. What might work for one organization maybe doesn't necessarily work for your organization, or you might have to start it in a different way. How do you embed it into who you are, but then also continuing to readjust? Maybe you try something and it works really well. How do you know it worked well? Are you evaluating that success? And if it didn't work out, what do you need to tweak and what do you change? So evaluation is a key component. And then this continues on, right? And then we continue to say, all right, what do we need to assess? What do we need to change? How do we continue to educate? What do we implement? How do we hold folks accountable and continue to evaluate that process? So I'm going to talk a little bit about, more from a practical standpoint, some of the ways we've embedded much of what we've been talking about at Excellus. I've been in my current role for 2 years now. And so when I first got into this role, DEI was that poster on the wall. People could point to it like, there's an office over there, right? There's people over there who are hired to do this work. But that wasn't really part of the organizational culture then. If it's one person's job or a department's job to implement DEI, then we're going about this all wrong. So one of the first things within my role was to change the expectations. Was very clear about the fact that it takes all of us. It's not my job to change the organizational culture, right? I can set the strategy, I can help, implement a variety of different initiatives, but it would take everyone at our organization. And so it was helping our employees start to get engaged and realize like they're a part of this. If we're not engaging employees, so it was a top-down leaders, and then also the bottoms up in terms of engaging our employees in this work as well. We also at the time were the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We weren't talking about equity. We weren't talking about access. So adding those components and some education around that. And then having a new strategy for the organization that really talked about a variety of different things and looking at diversity beyond hiring. So I love that it was mentioned earlier, right? Diversity is not the end goal. It was also, we could hire folks into the organization, but were they feeling welcome? Did they have a sense of belonging? Were they staying within the company? And so we had some work to do around defining what was it that we wanted to do for our company. The why became really important too, especially over the last year. Why were we talking about structural racism as a health plan? And so maybe some of you within your businesses are having the same conversations, like, this is a place of business. Why are we talking about these issues? Well, for us, we were able to make a very clear connection that structural racism, right? It's a driving force in the social determinants of health. And as a health plan, we can't fulfill our mission about making our communities healthier if we're not addressing the barriers that are in place, right? So racism is one of them, but how are we looking at homophobia, sexism, looking at economic privilege and so on? If we're not looking at those structures, we can't fulfill our mission. And so that was a way to start connecting it for our employees, is helping them identify the why in this. And so social determinants of health, you're probably all familiar with, but for us, this was also important for us to share with our employees because sometimes they had questions and they were like, why did we invest so much money into food banks? What are we doing that for? We're a health plan. Well, hunger is the social determinant of health, right? How are we providing a better access to healthy food options is one way that we can fulfill our mission, right? Why were we investing in education and economic stability if we are a health plan? And so connecting the dots for people became important. And I love what was mentioned earlier about people feeling a sense of loss. Sometimes it's more fear of not knowing why we're doing something. And so the unknown creates that fear. And so we were able to kind of help educate and bring our employees along, and our leaders for that matter too. So at our organization, we talked a lot about the idea mindset. Actually, I wonder if you're all seeing this too. So we talked a lot about we needed language for folks. And so what we rolled out back in 2019 was what we call our idea mindset and then taking action. And so it's the lens through which we approach our work. This is not only a part of onboarding, right? Bringing new employees on. This is something that our employees see and hear about each and every day. So recognizing, right, that it takes action in order to create a more equitable organization. We can't just say we want to be inclusive or that we want to be an equitable or diverse organization. And that part of that means examining our own biases and privileges. And so having those conversations openly became really important. And then also helping folks understand that this can be uncomfortable. So it is about pausing and recognizing that being uncomfortable is part of growing. We might not always have all the answers and maybe some things we're not familiar with, but the more we engage and the more we lean in, the more we're able to continue to grow. And these uncomfortable conversations may continue to make us stronger. So we defined, right, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access for our employees. And access became a really important one. Again, access to healthcare, access to services. What are those barriers? And what can we do to level the playing field, not only for our employees, but also for our members? And then, so some highlights in 2019, as I mentioned, we kind of, I ended up talking about why this was everyone's responsibility, but I also started with leadership, having them read a book on white privilege. And then we had a retreat to talk about their own experiences, because for many of them, they didn't necessarily realize or understand the concept of white privilege. And if I couldn't get our leadership to understand the importance of us having these conversations, it was going to be harder for me to drive this work throughout the company. So we started there with our leadership. We rolled out, as I mentioned, the idea mindset, what that meant, examples of how employees could apply this to their work. So again, helping bring everyone along to say we're in this together. We also launched an internal website with resources and information. And then one of the things we also started to do is we launched a lock screen campaign that we're still doing to this day. Every week there's a different lock screen, but we also include at least once a month some form of lock screen related to a DEI message as well. And we also did a lot of training for our leaders on how to embed this and how to talk to their employees about this work as well. So here are some examples of some of the early ones that we had out in terms of our lock screens. Really, this is something all of our employees see, and reminding them this is who we are. And each one of these lock screens also had corresponding blog articles of employees, right, sharing about who they are, why these particular observances were important to them. So it also created visibility that we do have folks from a variety of different walks of life within our organization and providing voice for those individuals. So I'll go through this last slide so we can get to Q&A, but in 2020, right, starting off with that baseline in 2019 allowed me to really push in 2020. So we had a variety of different things. We rolled out our first ever inclusion survey. Again, it was mentioned about experience, right? So we can have demographics of who's here within the company, but how are they experiencing our company? Are they feeling included? Do they feel that we're fair and equitable? And so we were able to roll that out this past year. We also had an internal Stand Against Racism campaign, encouraging our employees to stand against racism, sign an online pledge, and also engage in some learning during that time. We also brought the 21-day racial equity challenge in-house, so our employees could get credit on their transcripts that they completed this, but also it is to this day encouraged a variety of different conversations at various department level meetings. Many of them now do monthly, pulling a video from there or reading and discussing them as a team as well. So it's continued to live on. We also started a mentorship program that launched actually this month that is focused on our employees of color and really trying to create visibility and some career pathing for those who maybe haven't had that opportunity to be known by some of our executive leaders. Juneteenth became a company holiday, and the list goes on of some of the things that we did. So once again, start to raise awareness and education and bring our employees along the journey with us so that they recognize, right, this was important for all of us. We also assigned learning to all employees. So just the way we assign our, annual trainings in terms of compliance, right, and some other mandatory annual trainings, we also did assign some trainings related to racial equity and structural racism so that our employees recognize like this was just as important as any other trainings. I also believe in taking an intersectional approach. So we do a lot. Today, I'm talking more about the racial equity side of the house and the work that we've done. We do a lot in the LGBTQ+ space. We're doing some work in the disabilities arena and starting to add some more focus within our DEI strategy on veterans populations as well. Because even when we're focused on racial equity, right, we have people that are not only part of they may be Black or Latino, right? And also part of the LGBT community, or what are the unique issues that women of color face, for example. And so this has become a really important component as well. I'll stop there just due to timing, but I thank you all for giving me some time to be with you today.
Thank you, Sadie. I think the presentation portion that you just shared really just highlights and summarizes in many ways the points presented by each of the previous panelists, which is, I knew it would emerge, but the rollout of it, I think, was really, really dynamic, even for me sitting back and watching. We're gonna open it up. The chat has been really active, which is great, for Q&A. And I'm going to ask our attendees, if there's someone with a pressing question, you can use the chat if you want to come off a mute and ask a question. I believe we've given you permission to do that. I'll just kick it off and say, briefly, if each of the panelists just want to hit on why are you doing this work? For many of you, it's evident you have years in. This has been work you've done prior to 2020. So COVID in the last year of racial and social movements across the country in response to a lot of what transpired didn't push you all into this lane. You were here before. And so really briefly, as other folks put their questions together, what brought each of you to this work?
Well, I'll go first. I will say that my walk as a student at an HBCU, not just my walk, but my mother was what we would coin non-traditional student. We know them to be traditional. All students are traditional. But she attended college when I was in second grade, and I watched her career in education transform our lives. We went from working poor to consistent employment. We had health insurance. She was able to afford a private school for me in New Orleans, Louisiana. Our lives just skyrocketed. And so HBCUs for me have been, an equalizing experience. And as I decided to go into higher education through my own very positive, because not every student has positive post-secondary experiences, but I did, and it is my intention and hope that the research, work, and practice that I help inform will create that for students. My work at FDPRI has really been centered around the guided pathway experience and creating career pathways for students in these institutions, but more so creating capacity for the institutions to train 21st century employees. And so that work in itself is just a very small piece of the pie of the work that I do around HBCUs and students of color. Yeah, I mean, it's been my own perspective, and what I've learned and gained from the students I've been interacted with has only fed the passion.
Whoever wants to go next really quickly. Lomax, what brought you to this work? And we have some questions popping up in the chat. And so if folks want to take a look at those, they can answer that as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I'll start off by saying, I've looked like this all my life. So I've been Black all my life. And so I can't not be a part of this work. I can't not try to make things more inclusive for my ilk. And so I would say as early as, middle school, I was cultivated to be a Pan-Africanist person, and first to, on a journey to being human, right? I've been othered. I know what being invisible feels like. And even if you're the smartest or most educated person in the room, those things don't miss you, right? You still experience those things. So you'll even notice in my presentation, I didn't use the acronyms IDEA or EDI or DEI, not because I don't believe in them, because I do, but because I feel like just as like breathing, like that's so baked into the work. In the entrepreneurial ecosystem building work, we use an acronym ABIDE to pick up belonging, but also to touch on, also access. And so that's how we kind of relanguage it in that space. And I think it's so important that if we're not holding space for the people who have shared experiences with us, but then also to across cultural lines, so that all of us can be added to the process of being human, like all of us contributing to that concert or that party, as our dear sister Amante-Jackson talked about, then we as a humanity, we as a global force can't thrive. And so it's literally the biggest impediment in this highly racialized nation, you know. So we have to do this work, because if we don't, who will?
While someone's answering, I'm going to throw Dr. Malika Carter from ESF asked the question, oftentimes in corporate environments, matters of belonging, diversity, inclusion, equity are often commodified. And if it doesn't make dollars, if it doesn't make money, then it doesn't make sense. If it doesn't add to the bottom line, then why is it worth it? As someone else moves into, I think, Nadrea, your points, I think Lomax, what you just said also highlights it, but how have maybe Sadie or Dr. Jackson navigated these topics in the economic bottom line environments that are designed to drive shareholder fiscal health? So basically in the corporate environments, how do we have these conversations when maybe folks on this call are even like, how is this going to impact our bottom line?
Happy to start. And then Sadie, I'm sure you have a ton of thoughts as well. I think for me, this is why the sequence of the change really matters, right? So a lot of times we want to do this work bottom up, right? Meaning we're doing it from the most junior employees up to our board or to our C-suites. But really to start, you have to build value at the leadership level first to understand that centering culture is a strategic plan and has outcomes that impact your culture over time, right? So starting with training your board and your leadership to understand what DEI looks like in practice, because most of us don't believe that culture is important, right? So that's how I started with, normally you start with something technical like a diversity balance scorecard. That helps the employer or the organization feel like they're going to see change over time. However, it's the role of your chief diversity officer, or if any EDI, which is the equity diversity, we've got EDI committees, DBIE committees, DEI committees, whatever your committee is called that oversees culture is often not the committee that has the locus of control to define the work. And they often don't have influence with leadership. Many times they don't sit on leadership and can inform the vision. So if you're able, a consultant's role, or maybe someone from that team would be training your leadership first to understand that roadmap that we just did. And so building value around culture and helping them understand that an investment in DEI is an investment in culture, which is an investment in retention. And that retention is an investment in the creation of a culture that allows your organization to maximize its end goal. And unfortunately, you do sort of have to start with that capitalistic trend. But when people do DEI work first, when they get into belonging, they actually see the value because you see climate and surveys change, right? That felt belonging. And so I think it's helping them realize that you don't impact your bottom line if the culture doesn't change. But just wanted to give some thoughts of how you can influence that. It's by training leadership to actually understand and to define the problem in the beginning, as opposed to letting them keep thinking this is about the bottom line. It's about people, right? And it's about a sense of feeling welcomed and seen in someone's mission and vision.
Yeah. Sadie, you want to offer that, and then we're going to.
Sounds good. I completely agree with what Dr. Amante-Jackson said in terms of it starts with the leadership. I mean, much of my work started working with our executive leadership. I meet with them still monthly, individually on a regular basis with our board of directors, because if you don't have that buy-in, right, who are the decision makers, who are those with the power, if you will, that becomes really important. But I also, to add to that, there's also a ton of research out there that proves that by focusing on strategy and focusing on DEI, it does in fact improve the bottom line. So knowing your organization becomes really important. If you are working for an organization where they might need to see the research and that supports that this is going to over time improve the bottom line, I like to talk about it in terms of it's good for business and it's also the right thing to do. Right? Because both of those things are true, going back to what Dr. Amante-Jackson said, right? It's about people. And if you don't care about people, right, like people aren't going to want to work for you. But it depends on knowing your audience, right, and what message do they need to hear. And then over time, helping them understand both of those things are equally important. The bottom line, but also your people are your biggest asset.
It is so important. And I love all the chatter in the chat. So Lisa, if you'll go put up the slideshow again, because I want to share a couple of resources that CenterState has out there. We're going to make sure that this presentation is up and available for folks that had to hop off or you want to re-listen. We're going to try to get you a summary of some of the slides and links that the panelists have shared. On the CEO, CenterState CEO equity site, we've started to provide some of these tools to organizations as well. The panelists that are here, a lot of their comments, and we'll be sure to invite them back, maybe as collaborators or contributors to the site as well in the future. A place to start, we've provided some tools on the site. We're going to continue to grow and evolve that site, so please check it and look for some tools that can help you, but we'll also try to get some of the ones we highlighted here. Lisa Matat also put into the chat the list of services that we provide. We're going to continue to do sessions like these, but we also are working with companies across the Northeast and further away to start at the top, as Dr. Amante-Jackson pointed out. And so we have leadership services, we have opportunities to work with managers and directors to think about belonging and building inclusive structures. And we're doing it through the lens of the work and in collaboration with many of the panelists you saw here today. When we think about otherness, when we think about the concepts of building pipelines to opportunity, like Dr. Njoku pointed out, or thinking about how do we create culturally competent frameworks or inclusive frameworks that Dr. Lomax played out, or if we think about how Dr. Amante-Jackson talks about the journey that you have to be on, right? We want you all to know that we're working with experts like on this panel. We're working with community leaders that are steeped in this work and have been trained in it. And we're going to keep bringing them back to platforms like these, to the websites, to help you all feel as if you have support and a way to start. It is so critically important that we don't just look at our educational institutions to be holders and leaders in spaces of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. As we've seen over the past year, it's also become more of a challenge that our corporate environments, our business leaders, the opportunities that they provide and the way that they impact our lives are really a part of the conversation. And so we are going to hopefully continue to be leaders in that space. Joanne Yarrow, your question about otherness, Dr. Campbell has provided some context for, but I think the most important thing that as I am leading this work within CenterState CEO, that I find to be really important is that across Central New York, we are a dynamic region. The reason I am here is because I believe the diversity that exists in the city of Syracuse, along with the challenges we have before us to face, is really going to create an opportunity for a diverse group of people to really become positively impacted. If we as a business and leadership community are able to think more critically about how we can build cultures of inclusion, how we can think about belonging in the workplace, how we think about cultivating leadership in new ways so that more inclusive practices are happening, right? I think that our community is large enough, but also small enough. If we were able to even take some of the jewels that were shared with us today by our panelists, we could make a huge difference in what diversity looks like in our organizations, who's leading our organizations, and how our students and youth in our community are viewing opportunities in this community, right? And I think that's so critical to the future of this work, but more importantly, the security in the future that exists within this community. So we have about 8 minutes left. We are going to make sure that you get contact information for the individuals that were here today. This is my email, so please feel free to reach out to me in the meantime, but we'll be sure to send some summative notes. We have a follow-up session that's focused on women that's going to be happening on March 16th, I believe, same time. That's a part 2 and follow-up to this. Dr. Malika Carter, who's on the phone, will be on Zoom with us, will be a part of that. Joanne Yarrow, who's also in the room today, will also be part of that session. And so we're just getting started. If you thought this session was good. In the 8 minutes that we have left, I want to offer time for our panelists to just really succinctly just offer some final thoughts. And I know Dr. Njoku has to hop off. So any closing thoughts that you would like to share with the group, and then we can go down the line.
Thank you again, everybody, for having me. It's been a great hour and a half and a little bit more with these panelists. I'm incredibly moved by the work that they're doing, not just in their own communities, but the ripple effect that it will have across our country and the people's lives that it would impact. I just want to leave and impart again a statement of advocacy for historically Black colleges and universities as pools for recruiting talent, as well as staking some resources to train potential talent that you're seeking for your particular organization. These institutions don't often get a lot of attention and acclaim like other predominantly white institutions or traditionally white institutions for that matter. And so they pose an opportunity, I think, for Syracuse to pull talent and develop relationships that will build on the community and not only build on the lives that they're touching, but also the economic influence that Syracuse can have, not just in your immediate circle, but across the state of New York. So thank you again. I put my email in the chat. If you have any questions about what we're doing with career pathways at HBCUs or asset-based evaluation, and thank you.
Lomax, do you want to?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me again, Doc Rogers. Kind of like the ring of that. So I know some folks call you Dr. J. Please pardon me calling you Doc Rogers. Appreciate you for bringing me into this brilliant fellowship of phenomenal luminaries in the space here and all of the wisdom from Dr. Amante-Jackson, Dr. Njoku, Sister Fisher. Humbled, eternally grateful for being in the space with you. What I'll lift up is that last slide that I shared with you really embodies the sheet of music that the exemplars I provided were read from. And, that framework was developed by myself to really emphasize what we've been talking about this whole time. In order to get to belonging, in order to advance equity and truly be inclusive and model that excellence, relationship building has to be at the center of the equation. We have to build human connections and authentically know one another, because it's through those relationships that cultural knowledge is cultivated or exchanged, culturally diffused. And it's by understanding when and how to leverage that knowledge within your respective organizations at all levels, whether it's policies, practices, procedures, or the identity that shapes out, or the underlying assumptions that are entrenched over time. It's about accurately or effectively leveraging that cultural knowledge and those relationships as conduits to it to really achieve inclusive excellence. So happy to further discuss later. I put my LinkedIn handle in chat, and I also gave you all my Calendly link so that you can schedule a 15, 30-minute or 60-minute meeting with me, and happy to dive deeper. I tried not to get too theoretical on you all. That's helpful.
Before we move to our next panelist, I put in the chat, thank you to Berkshire Bank. They really stepped up to help the racial impact and racial equity and social impact portfolio provide this opportunity, as well as more that are to come in the future, but also the development of the site, which has the equity pledge on there. So also if you are a part of an organization, please do that. I'm going to let Darnisa Amante-Jackson go next. I know she has to hop too, but I just wanted to thank Berkshire one more time.
Awesome. I just wanted to thank everyone for your presence, for being here today. And thank you to our other panelists, though many had to leave. It's just always wonderful to be in solidarity in this work. I think a lot of times, though we know there are a lot of people doing DEI, you often feel like you're on an island by yourself, pulling the whole island to another island by yourself. So it's always really great to be in community. And for those of you who are interested, like I said, Juhanna said earlier, I put my website in the link, which has links to all of my organizations. And the best part about this, folks, is I'm the only Darnisa Amante in the entire world. And I'm the only Darnisa Amante-Jackson in the entire world. So what that means is, I'm not putting a plug out here, but if you Google me, I'm the only one that's going to come up. So there are tons of videos and podcasts and informational sessions that detail that spectrum again, for those of you who are like, I want more than the spectrum, right? So you can find a lot of that online or in podcasts that I've done. There are 2 new podcasts out for Black History Month, which will be up on that website on Thursday. But you can find them on LinkedIn. Once again, I'm the only Darnisa Amante, so I'm very easy to find.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sadie.
So I guess the main thing I want to leave folks with is just the importance of allowing people to see themselves reflected, and whether that's in, your marketing materials, your leadership, in the messages that you have out, the recognitions that you celebrate. So, talking about Black History Month, recognizing too, like, people, not only recognizing folks that have contributed, right, to where we are today, but there were incredible Black LGBTQ+ individuals, right, who have done incredible work in the space. So if you don't know Bayard Rustin, right, he was a gay Black man who actually organized the March on Washington. We also have Audre Lorde, who is was a lesbian poet who's absolutely incredible. You've probably heard of her before. We also have Marsha P. Johnson, who was a trans woman who was instrumental, right, in the start of the Stonewall uprising. So I say that because so often we think about people as one identity, right? It's either we're targeting the Black community or the LGBT community or the Latinx community or women, and yet many of us share so many intersecting identities. And it goes back to what I believe Dr. Lomax Campbell was saying earlier, is the fact that there's so many components that make up who we are, building those relationships, getting to know people for who they are. And oftentimes it's not just what you see on the outside that really is important to their very being. So continuing to remember that, and it really is about building those relationships.
Thank you, Sadie. We're at 10:30, but I wanted to just thank you all for spending time with us this morning. Hopefully your souls, minds, and hearts were fed with the remarks and presentations by our panelists today. Part 2 to come next month on the 16th, same time, different Zoom link. We look forward to having you back. Please do reach out for questions, thoughts, check out the equity toolkit. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is tell a friend or 10, tell a colleague or 10 about the session today. Encourage others to sign up and join us in March. Following March, we will have additional sessions, but thank you all for attending today and for your time, patience, and attention. And let's do the work.